to the National LGBT Bar Association's Lavender Link Racial Equity Series called Injustice, and we're kicking it off today with the Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court, Richard Robinson. Chief Justice, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
We'll do a quick introduction. This is a gentleman, a jurist who needs few introductions, but Chief Justice Robinson was appointed to the Connecticut Supreme Court in 2013, was elevated to be its chief in 2018, and had served on the Superior Court and the Appellate Courts in Connecticut as well. He's had an array of public and judicial service, including being president of the Stanford NAACP, general counsel for the Connecticut NAACP, and is on the advisory boards and boards of multiple organizations, including Discovery Amistad Advisory Board, and the board of the Conference of Chief Justices. And unsurprisingly, Chief, you are the winner of numerous awards, including the Ebony Power 100 and the Quinnipiac Balsa Thurgood Marshall Award. I'm waiting for the award for guitar playing, but that wasn't on your bio. But the chief is an avid guitar player as well. So again, thank you for joining us. This video series is being recorded, and we will provide it on our website afterwards as well. So Chief, let's get started and dive right into the topic of racial equity. In June, you sent an open letter to the Connecticut judiciary about the issue of racism and racial injustice, and implored each of them to do more to live up to the code that we all have, is to provide equal justice for all. I will put a copy of a link to that letter in our chat as the Chief Justice answers, and I would encourage everyone to read it because it is quite a moving and inspirational letter. Chief, you clearly poured a lot of yourself into that letter. Can you tell us a little bit of how you came to write it and what you hoped to achieve from sending that letter out?
Yeah, that letter was actually very difficult to write because of my position. Judges and justices and courts usually stay out of sort of the social discourse, but there's a problem, and the problem is that there is a problem with equal access to justice. There's a problem with systemic racism. There's a problem with bias, whether it's beauty bias or gender bias. And I talk about all these things when I do education of judges and court systems. And I felt I had to speak out. I am the first African-American Chief Justice in the history of the state of Connecticut. And there's only about 4 or 5 of us nationally. There probably has been less than 10 over the history of the entire country. That gives me what I think is a unique position. I could either use this as a platform to promote real and true justice, or I could sort of sit back and not say anything. And courts traditionally, as I said before, haven't been saying anything. Even when I wrote that letter, there was some pushback from some folks in the public saying that that is not the role of a judge. You're not supposed to talk about those kinds of things. But I have to ask the question of those people. If you see that justice is not equal, if you see that access is not equal, then what are you supposed to do? I think the canons require us to do that. And one of the interesting things about 2020 is we've had so many things come up all at one time that we now have space to say things and have conversations that we couldn't have even a year ago. And I decided it was worth the risk. And I do think it was a risk. I think it was worth the risk to speak publicly and openly. To my surprise, about 30 Chief Justices and Supreme Courts and appellate courts have all written about that same situation, about how George Floyd has made it possible for us to speak in a different way. And I think that's actually going to help the system in the long run. Like I said to you last time we spoke, the interesting thing about 2020 is it's not the disruption we wanted, but it may be the disruption that we needed. And by that, I mean, it gives us a chance to really look at our system of justice. It gets to look at, we get to look at ourselves as individuals and figure out exactly where on this path we want to be and where we should be.
That's right. And in speaking to you earlier, it seemed like it was a very organic situation where various chief justices from across the country, independently felt the urge to do, similar letters or make similar statements. Is that your perception of how things worked?
It is, but I think there's a difference here, and I think the diversity we have on the highest courts of the states and District of Columbia, we have more diversity on those courts now, and so we can actually talk from a different perspective. I have noticed that the African American chief justices, for the most part, have been very vocal about what's going on. They've been careful, they've been measured, but they've been vocal. Could that have happened 20 years ago where you had a homogenous looking, Supreme Court? I don't think so. So when it comes to, me having those discussions about diversity and inclusion, I think that's a perfect example of why diversity and inclusion is necessary. Those folks who are out on the periphery, those folks who are disenfranchised, they need a voice too. They need a voice at the table. And until we give them that voice, until we have that voice, until we speak with those voices, this country will never be able to live up to its that equality that we talk about in our historical documents.
That's exactly right. And it's not only sort of people seeing themselves in the leaders of the court, but also, the perspective that you bring from the diversity of experiences that you
Sure.
have. And, as you mentioned, you were the first Black Chief Justice in Connecticut. And according to the Brennan Center, as of at least February of this year, 23 states, which is a shocking number of states, clearly almost half of the states, had an all-white Supreme Court bench, including 12 states where people of color are at least 20% of the general population within that state. And you've talked about sort of your perspective and how that helps you be a better jurist and have a broader perspective that maybe some of your fellow jurists don't have. How does a sort of lack of diversity on the bench affect the judicial system?
I think the evidence of that is what we're going through right now, where the courts have been somewhat tone deaf. We talk about how justice is blind, but the problem is justice that's blind can't see, and you need to see, whether that's mentally or physically, you need to see what's going on. When I do implicit bias training, I tell people that, folks my age, and I would throw Rachel under the bus at this point and say folks our age, but I'm not going to do that, Rachel. But folks my age were pretty much taught that we shouldn't see race. And so I can't tell you how many times people say to me, I don't see color. And I go, well, that's interesting, because you're missing a large part of who I am if you don't see my color. I can't tell you my story. You won't be able to believe it or even comprehend it unless you take into account the fact that I'm a Black man. A good-looking Black man, but I'm a Black man. And so I tell them, and everyone laughs about it, and then they think about it, and it's like, wow, you're right. So when you see somebody who looks like me, you need to take into account what you're doing. And you can't do that unless you acknowledge what you're actually seeing. A colorblind person can't do that. So this whole notion of justice being blind, I don't believe in that at all. I believe that justice should serve the people who are before us. And you need to really check yourself to see whether you have some cultural biases, gender biases, whatever those biases are. I mentioned earlier, we have a beauty bias. So one of the things and I remember sitting in New Britain, and an attorney said to me in pretrial, I'm going to do great in this case. And I'm going like, why? Because I'm looking at the case and thinking, this is not a good case. And he said, I have an attractive plaintiff. So I'm going like, what do you mean? People will sympathize with your client? And he goes, no, she's physically attractive. And I was horrified by it until I started thinking about it. And it's like, no, I actually get it. There is this beauty bias. And if you look at it statistically, people who are more attractive get higher verdicts also people who are taller. I come from a family where my dad was 5'2" and my mom was 5'9", so it's Dad would have disagreed with that. And not to mention, I modeled myself after my parents, so I was attracted to tall women, including I tried to date the center for the West Virginia basketball team. That was a horror show.
Did not go well.
It did not go well at all. And so I see Rachel put up good to be tall. Rachel, we'll talk about this later. So, by the way, Rachel is a good friend of mine, and for it's been about 30 years, and just incredible. If I can just take one moment of everybody's time to tell a Rachel story that actually impacted upon me and where I am today. Rachel used to own a yacht, beautiful yacht, and one day I get this phone call, and it's like, "Hey, I'm putting together this team for the boat, and I want you to be on it." And it's like, I don't know anything about boating. Why would you be interested in having me? And so she said, "Look, I'm trying to put together a diverse crew, people who boat and people who don't boat, people who, live in Greenwich and people who live in Stanford, that kind of a thing." And so I thought, Rachel's nuts, but let me try this because I'm kind of interested. And so she immediately sends me a book, and she probably forgot about this, a book on how to tie knots. And I had the time of my life that summer. But the reason why I say it impacted upon me, there was this one gentleman who I thought I would never be able to get along with. If you looked in a dictionary of stereotypical wealthy white males, this person's picture would have popped up. And so I just was sort of, I don't think I want to get involved with that person. One of the nicest guys I've ever met actually taught me how to tie some of these knots, and shared his history with me. I shared my history with him. I think we both ended up growing and developing from that situation. So I learned from that, and this was long before I started doing bias training, that I had some biases. I didn't see it on that conscious level, but it was one of the things that seed that grew in me that, wait a minute, even people who are quote unquote woke have biases. And that's one thing I really push people to understand, that it's not just the folks on the right. It's not just the conservatives. It's not just those kind of people that have biases that impact our lives. We have to look internally and see what we're doing with information. And it's a scary thing because everyone has what they call is a bias hole. It's easy for me to believe that there's something wrong with your system of judgment. There's something that you're doing to me. It's easy for me to believe that. It's harder for me to believe that I'm doing it. So I don't check.
That's right.
And if I don't check, then I'm going to keep repeating that same kind of a thing. And when I do that kind of training, people, I think, are less afraid of grasping the concepts because, as I said, we all have biases. I'll give you a very short example. When President Bush was president, the price of gas started like $3 a gallon, and it went up to like $6 a gallon. And everybody started losing their mind. This is crazy. This is too much. Barack Obama becomes president. The price of gas drops down to like $4 a gallon. And we were all going around, yay, this is wonderful. These are nice low gas prices. Before that, it was $2 or something a gallon. And we were complaining about the high gas prices there. So we had this anchoring bias. And car salesmen do this to you all the time with a sticker price. So we all have biases, just come in different forms. Yet people are more accepting of those kinds of biases, or the idea they have that kind of bias, than they are of racial bias or gender bias or sexual orientation bias. Any of those things, those are harder for people to deal with. It's more what my contracts professor used to say, gastronomical. He always talked about gastronomical jurisprudence. But your gut can be very tricky. If your gut is telling you something, my whole thing is step back and figure out why your gut is saying that. Another example is people will meet and you ever meet somebody you instantly start to like and couldn't quite figure out why, or do you instantly start to dislike? And it's like, well, why is that? Or if you're trying to hire an employee and all of a sudden you see that the person comes from your hometown or your school, it's like, this is your favorite person now. They could be a serial killer, but it's your favorite person now because somehow you've connected on that level with them. So when you start teaching bias training that way, I think people are more understanding that we as human beings all do these kinds of things. And guess what? If you know you're doing it, then you can do something about it.
That's
Sorry
right.
for the long answer.
No, that's great. And it occurs to me that as where you started of people who say they're colorblind, we never hear people say, "Well, I'm gender blind. I don't see your gender."
Right.
And so I think points to sort of how ludicrous that statement is. I think um, and as you mentioned, sort of how harmful
Yeah.
it is for minorities and
Well,
diverse people.
yeah, these things are basically, I've come to the conclusion that most of these things are basically social constructs than anything else. And then once we get past the fact that these are actually social constructs, you can change the construct. I did a presentation in New London, and I asked a gentleman, um, how did he identify? And he said, I identify. He said, what do you mean? And I said, well, how do you identify? Who are you? And he says his name. And then he says, and I identify as a white male. And so I said, okay, prove it. He said, what? I said, prove it. And he looked at me very puzzled. And he says, well, I'm white. I said, well, no. The color of your skin won't do it. Louisiana has laws that if you are 136 black, no matter how white you look, you're black. So that's not quite it. So give me something other than your skin color. And he sat there and he was like, I can't. And the same thing goes with gender. What is gender? I'm sitting here struggling now with this whole social concept, this concept that we have of gender. Yes. And it's like people try to treat it as binary, but we all know that it's not binary.
Exactly.
So we're afraid to touch it, though. So why are we afraid to touch that subject? Because culturally, it's taboo to touch that subject. We got to get past that. We got to get past these social constructs that lock us into these positions. The part I don't understand is why people get so upset about it and get so angry. I honestly don't understand that, and I'm trying to figure that part out.
Yeah, that is true. And I have a question on that in a little bit, but I want to go back to your letter for a moment. And I want to read a piece of it here. And, it says, people who do not believe we have a racial injustice problem are entitled to their own opinions, but they are not entitled to their own facts. Simply put, the facts are with me. What is at the heart of our societal refusal to confront the racial injustices and inhumanities of our past, including our recent past? I mean, it wasn't all that long ago that, that the police officers in Birmingham in Kelly Ingram Park were, aiming fire hoses at young protesters and sicking police dogs on them. Right. So how have we forgotten sort of even the recent history about racial injustice?
I don't think most of us were taught our history. That's one of the big problems. I had a conversation with Brian Stevenson not that long ago. And if you don't know who he is, please look him up.
Yes.
He's an amazing person. And this was at a conference of chief justices. So one of the advantages I have of being chief is I get to go to these things. This was virtual because it was during COVID. But I got to meet this incredible person who talked about this. And he was saying that it's really important that we start to try to figure out what is historically true. You look at what Texas was doing with its school books. It basically said there was no slavery, that they had these migrant workers from Africa. And it's like, not so much. I recently went to the African American Museum in Washington, D.C., which I really asked everyone to go to because you learn some amazing things about our history. Like I learned that there were only about 300,000 slaves brought to the United States, that over 2 million were brought to South America. And so you had this small population of people who were brought here and treated pretty horribly. But you got to remember also, it wasn't just Bull Connors and his police force with dogs
exactly
all those years ago. I was born 2 years after Emmett Till's death. Yet I lived to see Barack Obama become president of the United States. I'm so happy that my mother got to see that too. But my mother used to always tell me when I was coming up, remember Emmett Till, which is a horrible thing to have to tell, a 4-year-old. But I was the kind of kid who would talk about when I saw injustices. And I'll give you a specific example. We were in a grocery store, and there was a white man who was a clerk and a white man buying groceries. This was in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And the guy then goes to pick up the bag, and the clerk says, "No, I'll have my boy do it." And so the boy is this elderly black man who comes up, and he starts to pick up the bag. Now I look at this, and I was always taught, hey, respect your elders, and if somebody's lifting a heavy bag, go lift it for them. Mm-hmm. So I went to lift it, and my cousin grabbed me by my collar and said, "No, don't." And I'm looking back, but that's wrong. And he said, "You don't have to live here." And it's like, wow. So I had this incredible history lesson and cultural lesson that day where, no, I was in the South, and I could very easily become an Emmett Till because my culture was from Stamford, Connecticut. Although at the time, Stamford, Connecticut didn't have an integrated school system. So when people talk about a long time ago, it's like, no, I went to a pretty segregated school. My brother was one of the first people to integrate one of the schools in North Stamford, and he paid the price for that. So part of the problem is we don't really know our history. Our history's been mistaught. And that's why we have Black History Month. But I think Black History Month, if you want to be honest about it, Black History Month should be every month, because it shouldn't be separate, but it has to be separate because it's not being taught in the other month. So when people ask, well, why do you have to have a special month? It's because at least that's the one time you can focus on this. So you have history, and the next issue you have is the more complicated issue, which is reparations. Should there be reparations, and what should those reparations look like? That is a different conversation. It's not in my branch. Whether it should be in other branches of the government, I'll leave that to you folks to determine. But as Brian Stevenson said to me, you can't have reparations until you really deal with the history aspect of it. South Africa had a Truth and Justice Commission. Perhaps we should have a Truth and Justice Commission. And then we can talk about whether you should have a reconciliation commission after that and what it would look like.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think for a lot of white people, they go through life, and then certainly they go through childhood without having to have those conversations with their parent, or as your parent having those conversations with their kids. And, I think hopefully a lot of eyes are opening up that these conversations are happening. You may not have them in your own family because of the color of your skin, but it's a heartbreaking moment to have those conversations as well. And, another indication that our society needs to dramatically change here.
But you have to remember, that it's not just all long ago. I mean, I was a judge in the state of Connecticut when I got swatted. It was sort of a angry driver situation, and the guy flipped me off, and next thing I know, I'm being pulled over by the police for pointing a gun at someone. And I'm sitting there thinking about this and thinking about the accidents I've had in the past where I'll tell the officer what happened, the white person will tell the officer what happened, and I see the police report, and it's exactly like the white person said it was. So here I am, a judge, and it's like, no, I don't have a gun on me. Yes, I do. At the time I had a permit to carry. Yes, I do have a permit to carry. I haven't carried in 20 years. I'm getting Scottsboroughed. And the trooper looked at me and said, "What?" I said, "I'm getting Scottsboroughed. It's the Scottsboro boys." And he had a hard time wrapping his mind around it. 2 years later, that same trooper apologized to me and said that he doesn't know why it took so long for the investigation to get finished. But I was totally cleared, and it's like, I was pretty ticked off by then. But here I'm the Chief Justice. Well, now I'm the Chief Justice. At the time I was a Superior Court judge. And still, that lesson to me was, I don't care as long if you wear a black robe. You're still a black man. Remember that.
Yeah, that certainly sounds to be the case. And, I think, we're in a moment of racial reckoning that we haven't seen, in decades. I think some would say since, Martin Luther King's time. And so, but as we sit here today, it's been almost 9 years since the murder of Trayvon Martin. 6 years have passed since, the murder of Michael Brown. We're about 6 months past the murder of George Floyd. And each of these deaths, and there's countless others like them, prompted protests, prompted media coverage. But the murder of George Floyd was a little different in some ways because it affected white people. White Americans sort of took an interest in racial equity. And why do you think that is? Why now? What was different and why did it take so long for sort of, a majority of people to wake up?
I think it was the convergence of so many horrible things happening at one time. You had George Floyd, you had Breonna Taylor, you had several other individuals, and you had COVID-19, and you had the social unrest, not just because of things concerning Black lives, but you had this national debate going on where the country is so polarized. You have 50% of the people at one extreme end and 50% of the people seeming to be at another extreme end. And so you have all of this unrest. All of this gave us an identity crisis. Is this the America that we love? Is this the America that's supposed to be? And if not, why aren't we doing something about it? I think because of so many things affecting so many different people, that we started to take a look at things in ways that we didn't. We started to have the space to talk in ways that we haven't. That's why I said 2020 wasn't the disruption that we wanted, but it may have been the disruption that we needed, because we are having those conversations. You and I have had these conversations out in our little pods, our little groups, out in the fringe. This is the first time where courts are actually talking about it, where the executive branch is talking about it, where the legislative branch is passing legislation. You have this time in history that I don't think was possible 10 years ago. And it comes after a lot of us in this country were saying, we've elected a Black president. Things will be different now. Mm-hmm. But think about things historically. Every time you've had a big social change, a social advancement, like the election of Barack Obama, or let's take same-sex marriage. When you have that kind of a big social change, what happens right after?
The backlash.
Exactly. And so you had this backlash going on. And with that backlash coming in, you ended up with some of the situations we have now. But they all came at the same time. And so I think people really start to question what in the world is going on and why aren't we doing something about it? And that's different. It may have happened a smidge in the late 50s and early 60s with the killing of Emmett Till, with the killing of President Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society. But that ended somewhere around 69 or so. So I think that's it. I think it's just the convergence of so many different things.
Well, and even a few years ago, the statement Black Lives Matter was radioactive in many circles, and you saw in these last 6 months, companies and corporations putting out statements, and hopefully it's not performative, and they do commit, and you've seen certainly companies, including my own, making financial and other volunteer commitments to racial equity issues. But it really does we've are starting to turn a corner. I wouldn't say we turned a corner. We're moving in the right direction. Do you have concerns that Americans lose focus quite easily? Do you have any concerns that that this movement will stall because Americans 3 months from now forget who George Floyd is?
Yeah. I do. And that's because, quite frankly, this is taxing. It's difficult. It's emotionally just devastating to people. I look at my allies who, in my personal life, my very close friends, and I'm lucky to have a very diverse group of friends. But some of those people are talking about how horrible this is and they want it to be over. And I look at them and I joke with them. I know them enough to joke with them. And I say, look, you've only been Black for about 6 months now. I've been Black for 63 years. So you got to kind of get used to it. We're in for the long haul. And that scares me, that people want this sort of a quick solution and quick feel good. And then I want to go back to my normal life. But if we're really going to change things, it's going to take some effort, and it's going to take some tears and some sweat. It's not easy. Black people in America have been trying to do this since the
For
first
centuries.
Black person arrived at Jamestown. So yeah, it's a long haul. I wish it wasn't, but it is. I've had young people come up to me and say, "I'm so tired." And in that letter, I mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm sick and tired.
Yes. Yep.
I'm sick and
Being
tired.
sick and tired.
And yes, you are sick and tired of being sick and tired, and so am I. But what's the alternative? And then they kind of look at me and say, "Oh, yeah."
Yeah. Well, and in that letter, you also say you mentioned that in addition to the Fannie Lou Hamer quote, I know I'm asking a lot of you. I know that you're tired, you're weary, and maybe even rightfully disillusioned. But this is a battle for the nation's soul. And so, how have your colleagues on the judiciary reacted to to that aspect of it?
Surprisingly well. I expected a lot more pushback from some of my colleagues. The thing about judges, I think for the most part, they want to do the right thing. They want to be fair. The question always becomes, what is fair? And I can remember some of my white colleagues, and I know it may make people cringe to hear me talk about white and Black, but I think it's important for this conversation. But some of my white colleagues will say, well, wait a minute, you're asking me to treat Black people better or different. And I go, no, what I'm saying is you may not be treating them equally. You may not be giving them justice. The question is, what are you really doing with what's before you? And if you're doing things based on stereotypes and bias, because look at it, whether it's the national level or the state level, there's a National Sentencing Commission, which actually investigates federal sentencing, and you have to be appointed by the President of the United States for that board. There's a study, you can find it on the web. Unfortunately, I don't remember off the top of my head, but there's sentence disparity between Black and white defendants, even when they're the same age, with the same background, and committed the same crime. The Black person will on average get a longer sentence than the white person. And even when it comes to diversionary programs to release you from prison, Black people get less, they have less access to that. So the question is why? If everything else is the same, why does the data bear this out? Connecticut had the same problem. We once did a program quite some time ago where I had the branch get all that information together, and we presented it at our Connecticut Judges Institute. And the number of judges who were just angry over Professor Austin did the presentation for us, angry with Professor Austin for saying how dare she say that we're not fair? And it's like, where'd she get those numbers? She made those numbers up. And it's like, no, we gave her those numbers. And if you want to check, you can check. I have nothing to hide. Our numbers bear that out. We have a law in Connecticut called the Alvin Penn Law. And the reason for that was that Blacks get stopped at a higher rate for pretextual stops than whites. When the search is actually done on their vehicle, Blacks are 3 times less likely to have contraband. So they're 3 times more likely to be stopped and 3 times less likely to have contraband. Yet it's still continuing. Police have to actually report the color of the person they're stopping and the reason they stopped, and did they go on and search the vehicle. And the numbers bear out that some people are being stopped at a higher rate than others. And the data doesn't back up the stop.
Yeah, and I think you've done a lot on sort of cultural competency of judges and implicit bias within the Connecticut judiciary. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've done on bias within the jury pool system?
Thank you for asking about that. There was a case that came out, I guess about 6 months ago now, State versus Holmes. And Holmes, the defendant, brought up the problem with Batson challenges. And the problem with Batson is you have to show purposeful discrimination. And so how that plays out in a courtroom is the prosecutor will do the voir dire. In Connecticut, we have individual voir dire. It's in our Constitution. So you have the right to individual voir dire. but they asked all the jurors questions. When it comes to black jurors, you hear questions like, and the same question are asked of the white jurors. Have you ever been involved with the police before? And the person may say, yes. And so, well, how did you feel about that? Well, I couldn't understand why they were stopping me. I was driving my car, and then they searched my car and all these kinds of things. So, okay, that was a bad experience. You know anybody who's been arrested? Oh, yes, my cousin was arrested. And what happened? Well, they went to prison. Well, what do you feel about that? Oh, he stole something. He should have gone to prison. Yet they then challenge the juror because of these contacts with the police that the prosecutor sees as may create a bias in the person against the police witnesses. The problem with that is if you eliminate every black person who lives in an urban area who's had somewhat negative experience with the police department, you're not going to have black people in your jury. I mean, that's a real problem. The other problem with that is, as I said, Batson requires purposeful discrimination. So we had to affirm the verdict. The person was found guilty, didn't get a new trial, anything else like that. But I didn't want to leave it there. And I think many years ago, I might have left it there. Knowing this problem with Batson, I decided to do something about it. So I put together a jury selection commission. And this commission was charged with trying to figure out why blacks are so underrepresented in the jury pool, because they are greatly underrepresented in Connecticut. There was actually a trilogy of cases, and one of the cases was about that. The other is, I was a trial lawyer for 16 years, and I started thinking about my own experience with juries, and it dawned on me over many years, not just after Holmes, but that attorneys would strike black jurors off my juries. And it's like, you kind of go, well, why would they do that? And it was like, because they somehow believed that somehow the black juror would be biased towards my side because I'm a black person. And I actually had an attorney just outright accuse me of that. I was sitting doing a trial, courtside trial, a very interesting, very controversial trial. So it was making the above the fold headlines every day. One of my coworkers was trying a jury trial. We always tried to help each other out and do trials with a second chair. So I finished mine, and I went over to help my fellow employee at work. And I sit down he sees me come in the courtroom, and I sit down at the defense table. One of the things I had forgotten about me trying cases, I used to get a migraine every single trial. Loved being on trial, hated going on trial. So I had a migraine that day, and I said, Ken, I'm just shot. I can't do anything. I can't even see. And so he says, go home. I got this. And so I went home. He had a verdict against him for almost $500,000. So it was a huge verdict. A few weeks later, the attorney for the plaintiff, who should be celebrating, calls me and reads me the Riot Act. And he said what he thought I had done was despicable, I think was the word he used. And I go, what are you talking about? I'm always doing something despicable. Point out which despicable thing. And he said, the jury trial. And I hadn't tried a jury trial, a case in a while. And I said, I haven't done a jury trial in a while. And he mentions the name of this case. I said, I wasn't on that. It was Ken. And I remember, oh yeah, I did go in there for a couple of minutes. He said the reason why I went in there was to influence the one black male juror. Now, he would have stricken the black juror, if I'm no doubt about it in my mind, if I had been the trial attorney, or if I had been sitting second chair when I picked in the jury. And so I thought about it for a while. I said, wait a minute. You're saying that somehow I was supposed to mind meld with this black juror and get them to vote against their best wishes for my client? And he said, yes. I was stunned. And so I said, oh, so if Deborah, one of the female attorneys in the office, said if Deborah had been trying the case, she would have been there to influence the female jurors. And he said, yes. So I said, oh, I guess you were there to influence the short white males. And he had a fit. But it's that weird bias that and you see it played out time and time again, where white people don't have a bias, but everyone else does. You don't. When you see these Batson challenges, how often do you see a Batson challenge of striking a white person off the jury because the defendant is white? it probably happened somewhere, but so I really felt I had to do something about this. And once again, very lucky that we had all these unfortunate events, because people got really serious about doing this. And I also made sure that I got people, it's sort of a team of rivals. I made sure they got people on the other end of the spectrum. And a lot of folks said I was crazy for doing that. But I had to build confidence in this thing.
That's
and
right.
so I wanted all the voices at the table, which, by the way, is controversial. But I'm going to say this in front of everybody. I think we do need to have those kind of controversies. We do need to have those people at the table. If we chase them away from the table, how are we ever going to change things? And so I believe that I put my speech in the marketplace, it's better than theirs. I'm that sure of it, that I'm willing to have that debate. And I think we all have to be a little less frightened and have those debates, and don't chase the person on the table. And, let's duel it out with our words. But I got to tell you, I think we win every time. I really do.
Yes. And, and certainly, the long arc of the, moral universe is on our side as well.
If we keep bending it, that arc may not be natural. We have to bend that a little
That is true. There is some effort required in all of that. I wanted to ask you a question, sort of keying off of something that you said earlier. There's this lack of acceptance among certain segments of our population about the history of racism, or the existence of structural racism. That's clearly embedded in the fabric of our society. But there are also people who and are, I think, more vocal now, who are saying that even talking about these issues or protesting these injustices is unpatriotic or un-American. You don't have to look far to see what has happened in the sports arena for players who kneel. So how can we convince people that, wanting a better America, wanting a more just and fair America, is actually the patriotic thing to do?
Yeah. One of the things I've been trying to do is build empathy in folks like that, because they have these walls up and they sort of fall for the national jingoism. So by being who I am, I go to them and I tell my story. I think our stories mean a lot. When you can tell a person your story, we see the person in a different way. It's one thing to sort of see the other person as a combatant on the other side, and you have sort of this binary thing going on. It's another thing when I tell stories about, like the one I just told, where I was a judge of the Superior Court and I get pulled over for threatening somebody with a gun, and the cops go, they check the car, there's no gun. Yet I still had to go through all this stuff. And the person, oh, by the way, he was a convicted felon. I did. So I'm sitting there going,
and a multi-year investigation, right?
Yeah,
it wasn't
absolutely.
A quick rectification of the issue.
It was not. And it changed me in ways, and I still wonder if I have post-traumatic stress over it, but it changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. So if I tell that story, if I tell the story of the way when I was in that grocery store, if I tell the story about how my wife, my son, and I are all martial artists. I'm a fourth degree black belt. My son is a fourth degree black belt. My wife is our instructor. She's a sixth degree black belt.
Remind me not to anger any of you next time we meet.
Well, some people wonder whether we've ever competed against each other. My son, in the last competition we were in, he beat me by 1/10 of a point. And so
wow.
I'm happy of handing over the mantle to him. I did okay. And actually, we were the two finals. He got first place, I got second. So I felt very good about that.
That's amazing. That's great.
With my wife, she's my instructor. She's short, but she's really, really fast. And as she kindly reminds me many times, I've taught you everything that you know, but not everything that I know. So
I love that.
So when she says something, when people ask me, did I win? It's like, I just say, winning isn't everything. You can learn a lot from a loss. And I've learned a lot from her. But as martial artists, we travel all over the country. We've traveled all over the world. I've done demonstrations in Luoyang, China, Poland, Italy, Netherlands, you name it. But one day we were going to practice, and I stopped at a hardware store because I had forgotten something that I needed. And I buy 3 items. One of them was broken. I didn't know it. And so we're at the counter, and I said, oh, the guy says, oh, this one's broken. Just get another one on your way out. And I go, no, I don't want to do that. And he's like, why? And we were in a rural part of Connecticut that's not known for its Black population. I'll just put it that way. And the guy says, no, it's all right. Trust me, it's all right. So I said, okay. So I pick up the 2 items. I start to walk out the store. Now I'm walking out the store. I pass by the items. I pick the 3rd item up. I get maybe 2 or 3 steps, and somebody grabs me.
Wow.
And I sit there and I turn around, and he says, you didn't pay for that. And I look over at the clerk who said it was okay. And this guy is horrified. And he goes, no, he paid for it. He paid for it. And the guy says, well, I've been watching him. And so I look at them and I think, you racist MF. You have no idea who I am. I was a judge on the appellate court at the time. I'm a judge of I didn't say any of this, but this is what I was going through my mind. I'm a judge of the appellate court. I make more money in an hour than you make in a week. But then it's like, no, I'm in this little town called Winstead. I'm a Scottsboro boy. I gotta be nice. I gotta play the game in order to survive. And so that's what I did. I still feel emasculated from that situation.
Yeah.
So, it's not something that happened a long time ago. It's something that happens every day to people of color. And I'm sure it happens to you, where you're just not quite as, what's the old Animal Farm saying? All animals are equal. Some animals are more equal than others.
Yes.
So yeah, you got equality, but.
Well, and, I think that's the huge misperception and misconception that a lot of white Americans say, because they look at their colleagues and say, there are, successful Black or African Americans that I see day to day. But, they also fail to realize that, you don't walk around, in your judicial robes or with a sign saying, Chief Justice. When you encounter racists like that, they see you as Black first and everything else, 4th, 5th, and 6th, right?
Sure.
And I think that's the disconnect that a lot of white Americans don't realize, is that that no matter what you achieve and how successful you are still subjected to racism, and sometimes really intense racism, and potentially even violence because of the color of your skin.
Yeah. Our power structure wasn't designed around people who look like me or people who act like me. When I was nominated to become Chief Justice, I would do something that my wife kept telling me not to do, which is I would read not just the newspaper articles, but I would read the comment section of the newspaper article.
Never a good idea. Yes.
Yeah, she's absolutely right about that. But to be honest, I felt I needed it in order to do the things that I needed to do as Chief Justice, to deal with these problems that are out there. I can either ignore it or I can look at it and try not to wallow in despair after doing that. So I did look at them. And there was a common theme, which was the only reason why he's getting appointed is because he was Black. That never would have happened to a straight white male. The only reason why you're being appointed is because you're a straight white male. It just wouldn't have happened. As a matter of fact, the person who was nominated before me was the first openly gay individual on the Supreme Court. Andrew Mcdonald was just a wonderful guy who took quite a beating during his nomination process. And they did the same thing to him. Mm-hmm. And that actually helped me to become more woke, because it's like, before I'm going like, this only happens to a Black man. It's like, no, this happens to other Americans too. And I'm going to digress for a second. One of the things I think we have to be careful about is the cancel culture. And the reason why I say that is because there's some people who learn from life experiences. I'm not saying there are some people who should never be canceled. I'm saying that we need to be very careful who we cancel and why we cancel. And the reason for that is because I've learned things over the years that, quite frankly, I'm a different person today than I was 10 years ago. I look at things deeper. I feel things more deeper. The example I just gave you is one of them, where Andrew went through this, and I just didn't see that before. Now I see that. And so it's like, okay, let me pull that in and do something about that too. The selfish part of me says, I need to do something about that in order to make my situation in life better. Because if they're able to treat him that way, they will still treat me that way. So there's a selfish component to it. But I think I said this to you the other day. Not all of us who are woke are conscious. So it's like we got to check ourselves. We really do.
Yeah, that's right. And you want to give people, room to grow and change and evolve as well.
You do. At the same time, you don't want them to, mess you over either. So it's a careful balancing act, but I think we have to make it conscious that we need to do that balancing act. My whole thing is to keep people at the table. There are some people who don't deserve a place at the table and they won't get one. The question is, what are your standards to do that?
Yeah, that's a very good way to think about it. And, clearly with, your jury service committee and the other work you've done, you live by that mantra as well.
I try to.
Well, in the last few minutes that we have, I want to ask you one question and then open it up to the audience for any questions. So if you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A function. Use the Q&A function and not the chat function. That would be preferable. But as those are coming in, while there's a lot of the members of the National LGBTQ+ bar who have intersectional identities, we also have a lot of white members, of course. And if you could ask our white members to do one thing to advance racial justice in their daily lives or in their lives, what would it be?
I would say stop looking at the horizon and start looking close to home. I'm often asked this question, and the first thing I'll say is, are you on any of your local committees? Are you a member of your local government? If not, get involved. Because, and I mentioned this earlier, the mere fact that you have a more diverse group of people working at something changes the group. There was a case here, and I'm be very careful how I talk about things. There was a case here before I got here involving two Black murder suspects who the murder occurred in New York. There was information that the murder suspects were in Stamford, Connecticut. As they're looking in this area where they think these guys are, this elderly white man comes up to the police and says, "Hey, what's going on?" They said, "We're looking for these guys who are murder suspects." And two Black guys who are murder suspects. And the guy says, "Hey, my tenant likes Black guys. You ought to check her out." And so they do. And they get a search warrant based on that.
So wow.
Because there are two Black guys at her apartment. And it's like, this court affirmed it. And I'm going like, what are you doing? That basically means if somebody's robbed outside of this courthouse and they say, "Hey, there's a Black guy who works in that building," you're going to get a warrant? I mean, that's not probable. If he said two white guys, would that have been, probable cause for a warrant? So we had that conversation and people started thinking about that. People in my court started thinking about it in different ways. It's like, well, wait a minute, hold it. There's something different about this. Another example was a video that had some interesting, and I gotta be very careful, we haven't done this one yet, but it had some interesting cultural elements in it. And the white people on the court saw it one way, and the Black people on the court, me and Justice Mullen, saw it a whole different way.
Interesting.
It's like, well, no, that's that shows that they're into that culture, that lifestyle. That's dangerous, and it's like, or they could just be doing that, for show. It's like that person could be the president of the Key Club or something. You don't know. That doesn't really tell you anything about the person. So it's interesting how we can talk about that cultural overlay to that and say, it may not be what you think it is. So that conversation actually changes how the court views things. That can happen on a zoning commission, a planning commission, human rights commission, whatever you're doing. But look close to home and look at your own actions and how, whether you're doing things that help this sort of system to continue, or you're doing things to become woke, to truly woke. And that includes talking to the crazy uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner table that we all have. It's like, no, Uncle Charlie, you can't say that. That helps. It really does. But to ignore the crazy uncle and the crazy relatives, I'm not saying you have to go in a full blown fight with them, but I think you do have to speak out.
To challenge, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are things you shouldn't let go unchallenged. Either as because it's either seen as a tacit endorsement, or and it certainly doesn't change their long-term behavior.
Yeah.
Either.
You're giving them space to continue that behavior.
Yeah. We have one question come in that is fantastic, and I want to ask this to you as our last question here. For those of us who sometimes struggle with invisible barriers at work and elsewhere, what kinds of self-advocacy have served you well along your career?
I tend to be vocal, even about the invisible. And the thing is, you have to find a way to do that and create a safe space for whoever you're talking to. That may sound like it's pandering, but I don't think it is pandering. If that person leaves the table, then you can't continue the conversation. So it's very difficult to figure out how to build those safe environments. I told you one of the things I do is I sort of look at human behavior in general and say, this is what human behavior does outside of the context we're talking about, whether it's race or culture or whatever. Here's what humans do. Then I take it and apply it to the situation that we're talking about. And you'd be surprised how many times people have that, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way moment. The other thing is, I think you have to find ways to make people confront the situation. I'm a black man walking down the street. What are you doing with that information? I had a friend once tell me, it must be so hard for you because you can actually see the category that's in question. And I go, I think it's actually harder for you because you can't.
Yeah.
And so you have the option to hide that, but it makes you feel like crap. Why would you do that? So I force the issue. It's like, no, I'm a black man. Here I am. What are you doing? It's not so much deal with it, but it's what are you doing with the information that you're receiving right now? Because if you ignore it, then you can't deal with those dark things inside you.
That's right. Well, Chief Justice, it's been a pleasure being with you today virtually, and you've shared so much, and we look forward to seeing the changes that you're bringing about within the judicial system in the state of Connecticut as well, and making it a more just and more diverse, friendly judicial system. And so thank you so much for being with us. Again, we will post this on our website, but also look for our upcoming Injustice webcast next month, January the 13th. We'll have Zabler Stout, who is the author of Our Gay History in the United States, who's going to talk about LGBTQ plus and Black history. And then in February, we have several members of our board of directors talking about how to elevate and activate for your Black colleagues. So please join us for those. A special thank you to our board member, Rachel Goldberg, who's a dear friend of the Chief Justice, and who connected us, and who you've heard a little bit of stories about. I don't know if Rachel will invite all of us on boating trips, but feel free to reach out and ask her. And she may kill me for this at our next board meeting, but thank you again, Chief. We look forward to hearing you play someday as well. So, wish everyone a very good month of December. Please stay safe as we continue to deal with the pandemic, and we look forward to seeing you here back again in January. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Take care.